that the things that I prefer lightweight, I prefer portable, and I prefer performant.
That is Suraj Pillai, a Salesforce architect and senior developer over at Vertex Systems. I'm Josh Burke, your host of the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down and talk with Suraj for a variety of projects that he has done around Apex and Lightning Web Components. You're going to hear a little bit about Flow. You're going to hear a little bit about universal mocking, and you might just hear how he gets a lot of work done really, really quickly using Neovim. But we start, as we often do, with his early years and his first memory of a computer.
My earliest memory would be, I think this was probably when I was 10, 11, maybe somewhere around there, or maybe even a little younger than that. One of my cousins had gotten an old, these monstrous black and white computers recently, and that's when I saw it for the first time, and I started playing some of those old black and white text-based games. And I just loved it. I was addicted. You couldn't get me away from the computer. So that's my earliest memory of a computer.
So are we talking like Zork, or were you like a classic adventure guy? Like what was your first text adventure game?
I think it was a game, if I remember correctly, it was a game called Detective, where they would, give you a mystery to solve, and then you would be presented with some text describing the situation. And then they would give you three options. Okay, where do you think the burglar or the killer could be? Is it an A, a gym, a B, supermarket, C, wherever? And you have to kind of use your clues that you're given beforehand to figure out where they would be. So that was the game.
Nice. And then when did you start developing with Salesforce? I
think 2013 is the year when I really started developing with Salesforce. Okay. Before that, I think the first time I heard of Salesforce was somewhere around 2011. But that was when I didn't really know much about the cloud, or I hadn't really gotten much into it. And I took a brief look at it, and it didn't really make much sense to me at that time. I was like, yeah, it's probably not worth my time. And I was, super into programming with Java and all that. So then I came back to it because I was hearing more and more about Salesforce and kind of all the conversations and communities and stuff. Came back to it in 2013. And that's when I really started diving into it and getting trained and learning about it more.
Got it. And describe your current job to me.
So currently I am a Salesforce architect and senior developer at Vertex Computer Systems. So as part of my job, a lot of my job is working with customers directly to figure out, what the requirements are and to build the solutions or design the solutions and kind of talk through the requirements and figure out that they're not digging themselves into a trench with the requirements they come up with, to put it mildly. But and so and then of course coordinating with the rest of the team, figuring out who needs to do what, and doing a lot of the hands-on stuff myself. That's in a nutshell what my job would be.
Got it. How would you compare learning and getting into Salesforce compared to the earlier stuff that you did, like learning Java and C++?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Java and C++. So when I was learning C++, I had no programming background. And, I don't claim to be an expert in C++, but, it was all very novel to me. So I don't necessarily think I would compare that with the rest of the journey. But learning Java, there's a lot to learn, obviously, right? So you're kind of like learning it step by step. You have to go slow. You can't really, start building a full-fledged application on day one. You have to really go slow and kind of try to learn the concepts really thoroughly before you get into it. With Salesforce, having that Java background, learning Salesforce, I would say, was a lot more easier.
Okay.
Because, once you get past the initial mental block of, okay, what is this thing doing and how is it structured? Once you get that basic abstract down, the rest of the stuff just, becomes easy, at least from a beginner perspective, to kind of make sense of, okay, what is this whole thing playing at? So.
Gotcha. You had that kind of blueprint of Java that you could kind of cast onto Apex as you were learning it.
Right. Yeah. When I was learning Apex, it seemed like a very trimmed down version of Java. And so it can be a positive and a negative. So, if I was learning Apex before learning Java, I might have paid more attention to detail and, tried to spend some time learning the core concepts a little bit more. But having the Java background, when you read Apex code, it just kind of makes sense. And you're like, okay, this is how it's done and all that. So, but I think that might have, hurt me, at least in the early years, because I didn't really spend enough time learning a lot of the core concepts the way it should be.
Got it. Now, okay, so C++, first of all, jumping into C++ for your first programming language, like, congrats. Like, that's definitely hitting into the deep water of the pool, to get things started. But C++, Java, Apex, what got you into JavaScript? Was it just like you wanted to become more of a full stack developer?
So JavaScript. So I actually, this goes back a little bit to the very first project that I was a part of. And we did a lot of like Java work, but also there was some front-end HTML facing work. And then there's a lot of database and shell scripting as well. What particularly interested me about JavaScript was one fun application that I kind of built. I was working on my first project. So we had this ticketing system that the client would use to create tickets. And every time a ticket gets logged, our project managers, whoever was in charge of the ticketing system that week, had to log in, look at they have to constantly keep refreshing to see if there's a new ticket. And then they would have to assign it to the respective team. So this was around the time that I kind of like started getting my hands dirty with jQuery. And I was like, why don't I build something using jQuery that just constantly polls the system for new tickets, just grabs the HTML, uses regular expression to look for the ticket number. If there is a new ticket, then just, pop up an alert or whatever instead of someone having to manually keep refreshing the page. And
got it.
That was one of the first JavaScript applications I built. From there was no looking back. I mean, I was just, completely mesmerized by JavaScript.
That's awesome. What are some of your favorites now? Because I'm assuming you're not still tinkering around with jQuery. Like, what's some of your favorite libraries to leverage?
So LWC is, obviously the library that I work with the most, and I really like it.
Nice.
React, I have dabbled with it, but I'm not a huge fan of JSX. So I wouldn't say React is my favorite library. My favorite library recently has been Svelte. I've been learning more and more about it, and I kind of like how it doesn't try to do too much, but also just gives you enough to do your work. And at least to me, it seems quite similar to LWC as well. So I like Svelte.
Nice. I have always leaned to those as well, I think largely because I don't write huge web applications anymore. So it's like I always feel like the ability for a React and Angular almost feels like overkill for me, but the smaller ones like Vue and even LWC have always felt like a better fit as well. So I hear you.
Yep.
Now tell me a little bit about this repo that we're going to kind of try to get some highlights on. Like, what started you down a path of like, were there tipping points where you're like, this is too much of a pain point, I want to build something better that helps improve this functionality, and then I also just want to share this out to the world?
Yeah, so this repo that we're talking about, I assume you're referring to the LWC Apex module, the repo. And that repo has a very interesting journey. It started out by when, Flow local Aura actions came out first. And that's where you can like build an Aura component, throw it into a screen flow, and have it execute some JavaScript on the client side. And something sparked an idea in my head, and I was thinking, why can't we generalize that, and kind of build a component that can take any JavaScript as an input and then just execute it in a screen flow. And you can use that if you wanted to, if you were dealing with collections or arrays or whatever in a flow, and you wanted to quickly transform it using one of the JavaScript functions, array functions, map, reduce, filter, whatever. You could do that real quick without having to build a whole component for it. You can kind of do that on the fly. And so that's where the AnyJS local action repository came out of.
Okay.
And from there on, the next project that kind of led to was attempting to create JavaScript buttons in LWC. And I'm sure we have all used JavaScript buttons at some point in Classic. And when we came to Lightning, that was one thing, at least initially, that we all sorely missed. And I figured that there was a way to bridge that gap by building an LWC that could kind of take a generic JavaScript as an input and, do whatever you wanted to do with it. But then it also needed to have all those additional APIs that you were used to in Classic that allowed you to interact with Apex, allowed you to interact with SOCL and DMLs and all those things. So I kind of built those into that library as well. And that's how the JS buttons library was born. And then I kept adding functionality to it slowly. So it is quite feature-rich, I would say, in terms of the APIs available. You can do Apex, you can do SOCL, you can do callouts, like you can call out using name credentials from JavaScript itself. And you can also call out to your internal Salesforce APIs without having to do anything else. And you can call out to external services, not external services as we are used to in flows, but just in general, any external APIs using the fetch API as well. And then from there on, after I had spent some time with the repo, eventually I got to a point where I was thinking, why can't I, make this more developer-centric? Since I don't think admins are going to be writing a whole lot of JavaScript, why not I take this JavaScript button concept and then just build a suite of LWC modules that would allow developers to just import those into LWCs and avoid having to write Apex just for, doing some SOCL or some DML or just for using name credentials or whatever. You wouldn't have to write Apex anymore. So that's kind of where that idea stemmed from and led to this repository that we are talking about.
Got it. Okay, so a few follow-up questions there. Like those first two things that you were talking about, like being able to create local actions and then JavaScript buttons. So in both cases, you're like encapsulating JavaScript into a handy little container that can be accessed either through a flow or through a page. How much overlap is there between those two projects?
Between the first two projects, there's only a very small overlap, mostly because the first project, the AnyJS local action project, is a very small project. There's only one Aura local action that just takes the JavaScript and executes it. It's a very tiny project, but there is a lot of overlap between the second and the third projects, the JavaScript button project and the modules project. So sticking a little bit to the first one, give me a real world example of using JavaScript in a local action to like improve a flow. All right. So let's say you wanted to, this is an example that I have in the repo. So let's say you wanted to build a list button that you wanted to put on a list view where users can select multiple records, click on the button, which calls a flow, which in turn goes and does something with those records. Now, the example that I have up there is, let's say we selected a few records and you want to process that in flows. You would have to kind of loop through those records. If you wanted to manipulate it in some way, you have to loop through those records, create a loop element. And within the loop element, you have to do some assignments. And if you wanted to filter something based on, certain criteria, you would have to do decisions. So it adds at least a little more complexity from that perspective to the flow. Whereas if you were to use AnyJS local action, what you could do is just serialize the records that you're getting and use JavaScript to manipulate it, just add attributes or whatever, deserialize it, and then do your DML. So there is no loops. It's a very straightforward flow. And JavaScript has a lot of handy array functions to handle your collections. And the other use case, I would say, the one that I have used it most often for, is to redirect a user at the end of the flow to whatever page they may want to go to. So instead of having to write a local action to redirect them to a certain page, you can just throw this in, do a window or location, and take them directly. So it becomes kind of an all-purpose tool to have in your kitty.
Got it. And I'm assuming that's probably a bit of a performance increase as well?
I haven't specifically measured performance, but that would make sense because there's a lot more done on the client side with JavaScript, which we know is, performant for the most part, especially when you look at the small data sizes and you take into account the network lag. Yeah, I would think so. Should be more performant.
And tell me a little bit about the input-output there. Like, what is JavaScript seeing in that sense? And what are some of the things that it can influence? So obviously, it has access to DML to a certain extent. Does it have the same scope as the buttons library where you could do things like callouts or stuff like that?
No, the local actions library is very limited. It doesn't have access to any of the additional SOCL or DML or anything. It's very strictly just for doing any kind of client-side JavaScript processing.
Got it. Nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the JavaScript buttons themselves. Basically, actually, same question. And so I assume there might be a same kind of answer, but what are a couple of real world things that you've done with it?
So I have used it mostly for kind of prototyping. So some of the real world examples that I've actually built in the repo, and I've used it also, is let's say since I have access to Salesforce APIs, there's a lot more I can do with it. For example, if I wanted to build a button for the admins to delete all the inactive flow versions, I can, through that quickly in JavaScript. I can use the tooling API, get the inactive flow versions using a SOQL query, and then just loop over and delete those. I have also played around with Composite API in there to create related records within a single button click.
Mm-hmm.
There's some other prototyping I've done is if I wanted to create some seed data in an org, for instance, I can call out to APIs such as the user. I forget the name of the API which gives you the user details, right? I can call that API, get contact details, and quickly create contacts within an org. I think it's called randomuser.me or something. Yeah. So
okay.
Mostly for prototyping is what I've used it, but there are some limited real-world examples or usages for it as well, especially if you use the APIs, the tooling API, metadata API, etc. Not metadata, sorry, just the tooling API.
What are you doing with the tooling API?
The tooling API, like I was saying earlier, I used it for fetching inactive flow versions and deleting those. I have used the tooling API for fetching debug logs if I wanted to clear out the debug logs from the system. That's a handy way of doing that as well.
Gotcha. Speaking of the modules that work with it, are there modules that you would like to see added to the future?
So yes, right now I am working on adding platform cache module to the repo. It's actually there in a separate branch within the repo. I have yet to write some more tests before I merge it with the main branch. But that's something I'm working on. And then in the future, I might add some modules for working better with custom metadata and stuff. I mean, we can already do that using the SOQL module, but, if I wanted to leverage the get all,
right.
For instance, I could do that.
Yeah, or skip a step and just talk directly to it.
Right. Yep.
Nice. Okay, so how easy is it to create those modules? Like if there's somebody out there who's thinking, oh yeah, that'd be something really cool I'd like to add. Like what's the level of complexity to creating a new one?
It is fairly easy, I would say. You just have to kind of understand the general structure of the project. So basically each module is its own independent thing that does whatever it needs to do. The main focus there would be the API as visible to the end user, and the API as visible to the core module that's importing or core LWC that's importing all these additional modules into it. So how you structure the API is most important.
Gotcha. Nice. Okay, so let's talk about another one of the things that you have up on GitHub. And mocking is something that's come up on the show many, many times. You have your own version of an Apex mock. What's the elevator pitch for that? Like, how does that specifically work for you?
So universal mocks was based out of a need to kind of make mocking a little bit simpler for me personally, because I've worked with Apex mocks in the past. I've used it in some limited fashion in some projects. However, I found the library to be a little huge for smaller projects. It adds a lot of code. And there were some aspects of the API that I am not too thrilled about. I understand why it has done, and it's, it closely resembles Mockito and stuff. But, it's just not, I felt like there was a way we could make it simpler. And that's what Universal Mocker attempts to do. But it sacrifices some of the strong typing that we get with Apex mocks in favor of making the API a little bit simpler to use and understand.
Got it. So you were looking for something that was a little bit more lightweight and tailored to kind of just what you needed, so to speak.
Exactly. It's just a single class. Anyone can go there. You don't even have to download the whole repo. You just copy the class, put it in your code wherever, and you should be good to go. And the API is really simple to do. It's almost reads like prose. Just mock, when this, then return this. It's as simple as that.
Got it. Nice. Now, speaking of kind of rolling your own, you prefer Neovim over Visual Studio Code, and you've created your own tooling set around it. First of all, why the lean/preference to kind of a pure CLI approach?
So you might have noticed this theme in everything that I have talked to you about so far.
Yeah.
That the things that I prefer lightweight, I prefer portable, and I prefer performant. Like these three things are what I look for above everything else, above features and above, being able to handle more use cases. And I had kind of dabbled with Vim since 2012, 2013. However, it's really when I got a Chromebook for the first time that the fact that, even though I was a Salesforce developer and we are all about the cloud, the fact that I couldn't just go into like a cloud IDE and start building, and I'm not counting developer console, but the fact that I couldn't just go into a cloud IDE and start building and do my source control and all that kind of really hurt me. And I wanted to be able to just go to any machine I want, just use a browser, log in to my IDE, and then just be able to code. And that's where I figured the only way I could do that is if I went to a terminal-based IDE. And, Neovim was kind of the natural choice since I had kind of worked with in the past. And I spent a lot of time making it work for Salesforce. And the CLI was really a godsend for that.
So first of all, I can completely understand somebody who likes lean and simple probably not favoring the developer console. I could totally respect that.
Right.
Now, so the CLI was a godsend. So you were attempting to go through this prior to the Salesforce DX quote-unquote revolution?
Yes, I was. So, I guess when I started with Salesforce development, the only option we had was the Force.com IDE. And even though I have used it for some projects, I wasn't entirely happy with it. In fact, if you won't judge me, I'll tell you, I would often prefer developer console over Force.com IDE because I just did not like the bloat. I did not think that Salesforce was that complex of a language with these many libraries that we have to use such a bloated IDE to work on it. And so I had been working on just using developer console. On occasion, I've used Maven's Mate, but there were some things I was not happy about it as well. And then when I discovered the Force.com CLI, that's when, it clicked for me. Oh, wait a minute. I can do this using a CLI. I can make it work with something. And the Force.com CLI was just really great. Really, it was an eye-opener for me.
Got it. So you basically got on the bus from day one. Like pre-Salesforce DX, we're talking Force.com CLI and that toolkit of being able to create and update and delete resources on your org. Right.
Yeah, I didn't have to actually log into Salesforce and to be able to use it from my local machine. There's a great Force.com CLI extension by John Aaron Nelson that works with VS Code. Ever since the VS Code beta came out, I had been using that because VS Code also has the integrated terminal. It has had that from day one. And so that's what I liked about VS Code. And VS Code is a great IDE. I use it still from time to time. It's lightweight enough and it has a lot of features.
Yeah.
And I had been using that when Salesforce DX came out. And Salesforce DX was a game changer too.
Got it. Well, tell me a little bit more about the tooling that you have been building around like Neovim so that you can, pull up documentation and stuff like that.
Right. So one of the things I like about the CLI is that, it has a lot of commands. It follows a specific pattern when it comes to those commands, the Oak Cliff design pattern. And also the fact that it's being constantly updated. There's a lot of plugins you can get for it to do very specific things. The thing that I do not like about the CLI is how verbose the commands often get. And, especially when you add the flags to it, and there's just a lot to keep track of. So one thing I had always been looking for is a robust autocomplete for the CLI. And since I was working mostly, in Windows and Linux, I've never found the CLI autocomplete to be reliable. At least back when it launched, I'd never found it to be too reliable. And it was a hit or a miss as to whether it would work or not. And so that's when I built my first autocomplete script. You'll find that in the repo as well for PowerShell. And it works great. you can type in a command, it'll autocomplete it for you along with all the flags. And that's great for PowerShell. But then since I was working mostly on the Linux side, I needed something more that would not just allow me to autocomplete commands, but also allow me to look up commands just by kind of fuzzy searching through it and give the help manual as I am searching for it. And that's where the SFDX script was born. FZF,
Gotcha.
for those who may not know, is a fuzzy command line finder that uses grep or one of the other find tools available with the CLI to fuzzy search through a list of things, anything pretty much.
Gotcha. And this is a podcast, so it's a little hard to visualize, but you showed me this, and one thing I can confirm is that it's really, really fast. Like, it's impressively quick when you pull that up on the UI.
Absolutely. When I have to write a SQL query, I don't even think about it. All I do is Control E Q, and the query is right there. And I just, before I know it, I'm writing my query away on the command line. So it's made life so much easier for me since I built this. Even when I install plugins, I can add that to the autocomplete as well. And I just use natural language search to just find the commands I need and look up all the command details, the switches, everything, and just type it without ever having to leave my terminal.
Nice. Okay, so straying away for a little bit from Apex, JavaScript, etc. Although I guess we've basically focused on mostly JavaScript. But anyway, going a little bit down the road, you have also some stuff with external services. What have you been working on there?
Yeah, so towards the end of last year, I had some free time, and I was, I turned my attention to external services a little bit because when external services came out, I was super excited. I felt like there was a lot of potential there, and there's a lot we could do with it. But I was kind of a little disappointed to see that, it didn't take off more, and, it wasn't getting as much adoption or love with the subsequent releases. And when I started working in MuleSoft sometime last year or the year before that, that's when I realized the power of like RAML, being able to define, use RAML to define your API specifications, translate that to OAS and things like that. And I figured, why not use that with external services to make any API work with Salesforce, and any API that you want, even if it doesn't have an open API specification schema document or whatever. You can actually create that using RAML and MuleSoft's API Design Center, which is free for anyone to use, by the way. So you can just go in. It offers great support for building your own RAMLs, autocomplete, proper syntax highlighting the works, everything. And after you're done, you can just convert that into an OAS specification, import it into your Salesforce, and use that to basically call any API that you want. And I played around with that quite a bit. I wrote an extensive README in my GitHub repo about that as well, where I worked with various Salesforce APIs and external services to see how you could use external services and communicate with any of the Salesforce APIs that you wanted. Got it.
Very, very nice. Is there anything else in the repo you want to give a shout out to? I mean, your GitHub in general, I mean.
So back when the CLI had just come out and I was using that for building one of our ISV apps, one of the things that was kind of sorely missing was the ability to generate a package out of your changes, out of your Git diff, going from one commit to the other. And this was, I think, back in 2017. So when I looked out there didn't seem to be anything out there at that time. And so I wrote the script for packaging your diffs into a deployable package, which you can then use the source deploy command or the mdap deploy command to just deploy that. So that script I kind of like. It's a very simple script. So it doesn't handle deletes because I didn't want to script deletes. But it handles everything else, additions, modifications, renames, and all that. And I know there's the SFDX Scalin, I think is the name of the package that does the same thing.
Got it.
But the script that I have, again, is small, lightweight, compact, and it does the job.
Nice. Is there a project you haven't started yet that you want to?
There are actually a couple of projects that I'm working on that need some more work. I mean, I'll talk about it. So basically, one of the projects that I'm working on right now is called Multi-Pick List Helper. And what I'm trying to do with that is build a robust solution that can take your multi-pick list values and create related records out of that so you can report on those better. So it's basically, it should be able to handle any volume of data that you have in your org by using queuables and batchables and all that, and create, related records in a custom object. So that's kind of a side project that I'm playing with right now.
That's our show. Now, the show notes will have links to Suraj's wonderful GitHub repo. Be sure to go check that out. Now, before we go, I did ask after Suraj's favorite non-technical hobby, and it turns out it's inspired by a little-known Netflix show.
So my hobbies keep changing from time to time, but ever since last year, I guess, ever since the Queen's Gambit dropped, I've been rediscovering my love for chess. I used to
really?
I used to play chess as a kid for several years, but then I kind of stopped. Life got in the way and it fell by the wayside. But since last year, I've been playing more chess and trying to slowly get better. So I watch a lot of chess videos and try to get better at it now. That's kind of my hobby these days.
I want to thank Suraj for the great conversation and information. And as always, I want to thank you for listening. Now, if you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Thanks again, everybody, and I'll talk to you next week.